Good morning, good afternoon, everybody.
Morning, Joni.
Morning.
Thanks for joining here. It looks like we've got, I think, a pretty good number of folks on the line. So thanks everybody for joining us today. We'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Joni Garlick. I'm a sales account executive here at Seacliff Consulting. Before we dive into the topic of today's discussion, which is mastering demand forecasting, as you can see on the slide, wanted to go ahead and kick things off with a little bit about who we are. I'm sure there's a handful of you on the line who may or may not have heard of us or worked with us before, so wanted to give you a brief introduction to us, and then I'll pass it over to our resident experts here at Seacliff, Garrett and Kyle, to introduce themselves. So with that, Seacliff Consulting is an advisory and management consulting firm based in Raleigh, North Carolina. We were established in 2017 when our co-founders, Garrett, who's on the line today, and Weston Drake, saw a gap in the marketplace of being able to unify business strategy and business analytics with technology. Started Seacliff to really bridge that gap. Today, we've got 3 different practices of our consulting practice. So the first one being finance and accounting. We have another one in asset management advisory, and then we do have a third practice in sales and operations planning, and have worked across several multinational enterprise companies over the last 7 years, combining our business and industry expertise along with the data and the analytics expertise to really help our customers solve their problems. We do also partner with different technology vendors as well. So technology vendors like Alteryx and others, really just to make sure that we're combining and advising what's important, which is the people, process, and technology. In our sales and operations planning practice, as you can imagine, with the supply chain disruptions and the need to be agile across demand forecasting and operations teams, we've been hearing more and more over the last couple of years from our clients asking us for advice or for guidance on how to ensure that their organization is really operating efficiently. And a hot topic of that has really been demand forecasting. So that is why we're here today. As far as what we'll be discussing, we're going to be providing some insight and thought leadership into the industry trends that we're seeing, some of the forecasting challenges that we've seen firsthand and with our clients, and then ultimately, what's our approach and advice on best practices to ensure that your organization is efficient and mastering demand forecasting. Just as a heads up too, we will open it up to questions at the end. So if anybody has anything that or any questions as we're going through our discussion, please feel free to pop them in the chat, and then we'll get to it when we get to the Q&A portion. So with that, I will go ahead and kick things off with introductions to our wonderful panelists today. Garrett, do you want to go ahead and start us off?
Thank you, Jenny. Appreciate that introduction. Yes, my name is Garrett Klas, one of the founding principals here at Seacliff. My background has been primarily in big data solutions, as well as working within the financial services and supply chain space. Been doing supply chain, particularly within the revenue management space, and combining that probably for the past 10 years. And we've been now focused more on the supply chain, given the fact that with a lot of disruptions that we've seen over the past 4 to 5 years.
Hey everyone, my name is Kyle Ledesma. Excited to be here today and share some of what I've learned. I'm a data science consultant, and I've been with Seacliff for a little over 2 years now. My focus has been on leveraging analytics to meet businesses where they are and to help drive better insights and decisions. Lately, that's been primarily focused around demand forecasting and optimization.
Great, thanks, Kyle. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I guess to kick things off, I'll probably start with a question to you, Garrett. You know, when we talk about the current landscape, obviously demand forecasting is at the front of the sales and operations planning process. So I'm curious to know what you've seen with our clients on some of their current pain points as far as like what keeps them up at night, and then maybe any trends that exist within the discipline.
Absolutely. You know, from particularly coming into the beginning of 2020 or mid 2020, I think what a lot of our customers saw, with regard to the disruptions from COVID, right, is that they did not have full visibility into and deep insight into their tiers in their supply chain. So with regard to the disruptions that they saw, they're now looking at collaborating with their suppliers and their logistics partners to really understand what do they have, can they get access to that data, and really understand what type of visibility they can in order to try to mitigate any types of shocks they might have within their production as well as within their demand. and also from an agility standpoint. Going in before COVID, we had our demand forecasting models and our sales forecasting models, and they fairly solid, right? There wasn't really much to change other than things that seasonal changes, as well as maybe adding or changing up the drivers. But when we got into such a global systemic shock and the amount of cash that flowed into the economies, the global economies, the idea of a higher supply with less demand, those forecasting models that they were built on completely inverted, right? So those models broke down and organizations didn't really have a way to forecast. A lot of public companies weren't even necessarily doing forecasts for a while during their earnings calls. And that was because they had nothing to forecast on. And so now they're looking for, the agility. They're looking for ways that how do we take data? How can we pivot based on our forecast based off of no matter what gets thrown at us, and be able to try to eliminate as much risk as they can. And that also gets back to the architecture, right? They need to make sure that from a production standpoint that they also have the ability to, pivot with regard to the products that they deliver, being able to change based off of consumer preferences. Changes which have changed drastically, right? I mean, if you just think of the past couple of years, EVs in the automotive industry are the new thing, looking at lithium mining in order to support that industry as well as many others. I've really, had people really get in and understand, well, what is our architecture? Can we adapt to that? Can we change? Can we introduce new products into the market? And what will that take? And that's more larger supply chain and more that S&OP process. Today, we're really focused on the demand forecasting perspective. But what we have seen with our customers, and to try to counteract, some of those or really answer some of those key things, is that they're looking at integrating or bringing in IBP. Looking at, can we do integrated business planning with our ERP systems that we have, whether that's SAP, S/4HANA, or Oracle, or JD Edwards, to answer some of these questions, to really kind of bring all this together. I think the key of trying to bring this all together is being able to bring this idea of the control tower. There's many concepts and versions of how people interpret the control tower for their organization. But at the end of the day, it's about looking at all the noise and trying to find that signal across your enterprise, across the data that you have, as well as working with your suppliers and vendors to really see how can we do better planning, how can we do better demand forecasting, and how can we do better decision intelligence in order to get a more accurate result and be able to respond to the market a lot quicker. So I think that using this idea, and every organization is at a different stage in this idea or vision, even has a different vision of what this is key in order to really bring out and harness the data, and particularly reframe or refine their demand forecasting process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All makes sense. And we're talking about demand forecasting processes, right? But Kyle, I know since you're in the weeds, oftentimes when I'm first meeting and talking with some of our clients, I'm hearing sales forecasting and demand forecasting really used interchangeably. So I'm curious to get your perspective too on how you really distinguish the two and what you've seen in your experience. And then maybe to layer that a step further too, could you walk us through what the journey of demand forecasting and sales forecasting and some of those nuances are, and what's required to really be successful?
No problem. That's a great question. Let's start off by talking a little bit about some of the differences between sales and demand forecast. There's obviously a lot of overlap between the two, and it's not black and white, but there are some key differences that I think are important to call out. Sales forecast is more about the top line and trying to predict the future revenue of a company. Typically, it utilizes historical sales data and tries to account for other factors at play, such as a product life cycle, pricing, supply constraints, things of that nature. Demand forecasting, at least to start, is a little bit more theoretical. What it tries to do is isolate the true unconstrained demand of a given product or a service given a certain price point. It ends up being a little bit more complex because there's all of these factors at play. So the goal with demand forecasting is to try to identify and separate those factors so that what you're left with is this unconstrained demand, and you can have a true measurement of how much a consumer wants a given product or service. And so what we often see is that companies, when starting out, in terms of building up their process. Start with more attributes of a sales forecasting where they focus on simple or statistical forecasting, again, utilizing the sales data and other components. And then as the organization begins to grow, they can start to be ready to layer on some of these more complex things on top of it. We go to the next slide, we can show what that looks like here. So in front of us, we have a forecasting maturity model. Wanted to start by saying there's different components to this. So again, it's not necessarily black and white where, you might have some elements that are more characteristic of stage 1 or 2, but in some other areas you might be thriving in and could be more closely tied in with stage 4 or 5. The way that we like to define some of these different components to a forecasting maturity curve are potentially the type of data that's utilized to create the forecast, maybe the level at which the forecast is created, the different types of techniques that are used, whether it's statistical forecasting or even more advanced cutting edge technologies. And then finally, I would say that the role of the different teams as they relate to this process.
Nice. Okay. And I'm looking at the maturity model, right? And you can see in the demand optimization, like stage 5 area, I see AI and ML called out. I know you know this and I know this, right? We're seeing a lot of clients talking around AI and how AI can support demand planning. So I'm curious to get, your thoughts on this and how that's incorporated.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely an exciting time that we can see already how AI and ML can impact this specific space. But I would say before we get into that, the focus needs to be on having a solid enough foundation for an organization to be ready for that. We find that as we work with clients, it needs to be identifying which stage they're currently at for most of these, and then working on in some ways, the low-hanging fruit to get to that next stage. If we jump the gun and try to integrate some of these cutting edge technologies too fast, it might actually bring more harm than good. So really, it comes down to what's right for the business and getting that solid process before you can start incorporating those.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, Kyle. Jenny, I think that's a really good question. I mean, it is an exciting time. AI, machine learning, they provide a lot of capability. It is the conversation in boardrooms, right? The executives are getting asked the question, what is your AI strategy? What's your machine learning strategy? And so, that gets pushed down or farther into the organization. But it's not necessarily always the right answer, right? And I really love this chart, Kyle, that you put together, because there are instances where just linear regression is perfectly fine and acceptable and is all that is needed. Sometimes the value that you might be able to squeeze out of being able to use machine learning and AI in maybe a product category or certain specific SKUs could be valuable, but the amount of complexity and the amount of upskilling and the technology and the infrastructure and the capital cost involved to it might outweigh the value. And so sticking to maybe some of the tried and true multivariate regression analysis or linear regression or things like that might be all that's needed. And like you said, different products, depending on how it's classified, I think could also help you understand, which model works best for you, particularly when you're looking at from a demand planning or from a forecasting standpoint.
Yeah, very good points. And it's funny because we're talking about obviously the maturity model and all the different pieces that are incorporated in it, and it really being a journey here. Kyle, you've been in the weeds here at Seacliff helping clients, but you've also had experience too working for organizations actually going through these demand and sales forecasting processes. So you don't want to jump the gun necessarily on implementing a tool before you're ready for it and all of that, but I can imagine outside of that, there's probably some other, challenges that come with going on this journey together. So what are some of those challenges that you've seen in the past organizations that you've worked for, or even with some of our clients here at Seacliff?
Yeah, if you can go ahead to the next slide and we can dive a little bit more into some of the common challenges that we find. You can see a list here, but I would say ultimately it comes down to a lack of visibility into the current process, whether that's because the process was built years ago or there's data loss from people coming and going with the teams. But there's often a gap between what the process is actually doing and what all of the various teams think that the process is doing. That discrepancy is what leads to a lack of trust in the process overall. And if you don't have that at the foundation of the whole demand forecasting process, then results are not going to be trusted and used. I've personally found that it doesn't really matter how fast you can get the results, how streamlined the process is, or maybe how complex the model is, even how clean the visualizations are. If the next team doesn't trust the numbers, then there's no buy-in, and I think the whole thing kind of collapses. And so I think with that, I would say my goal when working with all of this is to try to change the narrative around forecasting, right? I want to have the perception be moving away from this forecasting being this time-consuming process that's doomed to fail because it's never going to be perfect, and more towards something that is an ever-growing collaborative effort where all teams have a say in the process and the results, and there's a common interest in having this succeed.
Kyle, those are really good points, and I think that you hit on something, right? It is a forecast. It's the accuracy, you always are trying to achieve better accuracy, right? But you're never going to get it right. If we got it right, we might all be doing something different than what we're doing today. But the idea is to really provide something tried and true in that directionally correct sense of what's the best picture, the best outlook, right? And I really like what you said as well with regard to, especially on the demand planning side, and even folks, who might be doing sales forecasting that might be on this call. We have clients that have really rigid and great forecasts, and their accuracy is spot on, but they're still having challenges. It's not necessarily that it has to be a forecasting issue, right? Especially when you look at some of our clients that are like global enterprise compliance, with large subsidiaries, right? That might be, a forecast, within their process, it might be handed out or 2 or 3 degrees removed by the time it gets to maybe like the operations team and things. If they don't understand how that forecast was put together, or if that forecast changed over time because maybe the methodology was changed, but you don't have, good communication channel, then the way they might be using and consuming that forecast and the data might start skewing their numbers. And that's where you start seeing the deterioration of the trust, right? And it's not necessarily the forecast is bad. It's just that now they got to figure out, okay, well, how are we going to adjust for this? Because we always know that, based on how we use the data, we're seeing, they're getting different types of outputs in their analysis. And so you might start seeing inventory imbalances and things of that nature farther down inside your S&OP process or your operations side, which, can lead to all sorts of things. So you have high inventory, which, leads to, balance sheet issues, right? You can have stock out issues, you got lead time, and it just trickles, right? So it just adds on, and those multiples that come into that. So I think you're right. It's collaboration, it's communication, it's the people in the process outside of just the demand forecasting, which is kind of getting back to the point of mastering, right? It might not necessarily be the technology or the methodology, but making sure it is communicated. So
yeah, very fair point, and makes sense, right? And Kyle, I'll direct this to you, and Garrett, feel free to add any color too. But with all these, call it challenges or hurdles, whatever you want to call it, and the different stages that we just went through and different departments that need to be involved, this can obviously be a lot on demand planners or supply chain leaders to really make sure that they've got the holistic picture. But I'm curious to know what you found to really be the best approach or best practices that folks on today's call can really start to implement.
Yeah, let's go ahead to the next slide and we can go over some of these. So again, I think it's really important to understand where the client is at on that forecast maturity curve that we looked at a couple slides ago, and focus on, again, the low-hanging fruit that can help them get to that next stage. That being said, I would say these are some of the common elements that we always seek to implement to help clients grow in their process. I would consider some sort of model governance process to be the most important component to this, and how you can increase your forecasting to the next level. Again, model governance process essentially is the framework for how an organization can manage the model and the surrounding processes. But really, I think that's the piece that ties it all home. It's what gets everything in front, and there's a lot of visibility there. If things change with the model governance can show traceability as well. With things being out in the open, it becomes more of this holistic sales and operation planning process instead of, again, a black box methodology that gets passed on from team to team without really understanding how they arrived at those results. So ultimately is the foundation for trust. And you need some sort of good governance process there to foster trust between the teams and to grow this collaborative environment.
That's right, and I think the key here in that approach, Kyle, is that business process discovery, because everyone's at a different stage. In every organization, every industry is unique, right? And part of the secret sauce for every organization is part of their process on how they do their forecasting, as well as how they do their operations. So you got to value that, and you got to incorporate that into the process of understanding how to do the forecast. For instance, a lot of you folks that you see, you have these, templated forecasts. You got to plug in your numbers, but you got to look at the nuances. And I think you had mentioned a couple of slides ago around understanding the product or product knowledge. I think maybe is one of the challenges. I mean, that's key, right? We have, a client, that has 86, plants around the world, and each one is very distinct. It's its own living organism, if you will. And, one forecasting methodology is quite different and unique because the constraints are different from one region to the other, one country to another, and then also the type of the process that's being extracted. So I think really understanding that process is really important. And then before and then understanding, is it classified? Looking at the SKUs and understanding, is there seasonality? It's erratic, and if it's erratic, right? Can you even forecast it, right? Or is it more of that you need to look into your operations or sales operations side and look at the way that marketing to set it up their campaigns? Is there correlations there that might help give you better insight? Which kind of gets back to the idea of this control tower, right? You're using all the information within the organization to find those signals to really figure out how can we better plan and forecast our demand.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really insightful stuff too. And I think that pretty much wraps up with what we're, going to cover today. And I do want to jump into the question piece, but I guess I wanted to just open it up if there are any final thoughts from the two of you, because everything that we're saying is great thought leadership from the standpoint of it's not going to be a one size fits all solution necessarily for every organization, but would love to see if you guys have any final thoughts on that before we do open it up for questions and kind of talk about next steps.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly add one thing. I would say that for the forecasting process as a whole, if you can make it standardized, a way to whether it's roadmaps or KPIs, but to facilitate continual growth and focus on percent improvement over time, that'll send you in the right direction, and you can get less caught up in being behind, or hey, this is where we're not at, and those percent improvements will compound, and for every percent that the forecasting accuracy gets better, that'll lead to increased revenue and decreased costs, and just a better place to be for the business overall.
I agree with that, Kyle, and I think my key thing is around that model governance process. And I think this really something we really should emphasize is it's more than IT governance process, IT controls and things of that nature. This is more around the business program governance process, right? And I think, and this kind of gets back at feeding into that idea of your process and your people. Can you explain the way that you arrive to your decision of your forecast and how you publish it? Is that traceability there? And for instance, if you start seeing model drift or accuracy and fluctuations, or maybe there's different type of macroeconomic factors, which means that are now into play, you might need to change your forecasting methodology for a particular classification of products or SKUs or individual SKUs. That you're able to explain that and let folks understand, hey, we're using this one particular model. Whether it was linear regression, and now we're looking at doing some multivariate because of and they can see both of those and they understand, I get it, I understand why, I understand how you arrive to your forecast, and making sure that it that trickulates all the way down to all the other teams. So back to that point of making sure you don't erode the trust. You got to have a governance process internally. This is a business controlled process that lets people know this is how we're going to change our models. This is how we're going to let people know what we're doing. And this is how people also know how to have the most accurate forecast as well, thinking about forecast versioning and things of that nature, because we have clients, they can have 6 or 7 different versions of forecasts before they call it their final, because of just so many different types of demands and changes. I mean, you look at, the geopolitical risk and things like that, that stuff can change, by the day, by the week. So those models can change as well before the actual publication.
Very good point, and certainly makes sense when we're talking about this in the grand scheme of things, and how do you enable really all three of those things, the people, process, and technology, and make sure that everything is staying on track and everybody is, communicating, collaborating, and there's that level of transparency across the business. So appreciate the insights into that. I guess with that, we can go ahead and open it up to questions from everybody. So if there's any questions from the audience, happy to have you guys put those in the chat, and then we can go through those and then have one final thought. I do have one. So it says, what advice would you give us if we were looking to do a better job incorporating demand forecasting capabilities? Where should we start?
I could take that one. I think where you would start is if you already have a process today, what does it look like? And then trying to measure, where do you want to get to? And one of the ways you can look at that is what's your overall business strategy, your overall strategy, right? What are your executives, what are your shareholders and leaders telling you where you want to be, and how do you set that course? And then working back, how can you fill that gap? So defining that gap and understanding, how you want to change it. Do you have a rigid S&OP process? Is that maybe where you need to focus your time and understanding, what that looks like before you start looking into the demand planning? If you already have a sales forecasting process, can you utilize that as your stepping stone and then start looking at incorporating, how can we come up with unconstrained demand? Are we looking to increase market share, and how do we think we want to do that from a pricing strategy? Right. And so how's that going to affect our demand if you're thinking about it from a segment perspective? And if you're even looking to even get farther into that, right, you're going to think about, okay, well, now that we know the demand, we know what our sales forecast is, you start incorporating other attributes like, lead time, making sure you can get ahead of that so you don't have, stock out issues, things of that nature. But I would take it in progression. I'll start very simple of just mapping what you currently have today, where you want to be as an organization, define that gap, and then work into it. But don't try to do it all at once. And I highly recommend don't jump straight into AI and machine learning. Use tried and true processes of things that can be, I wouldn't necessarily say commoditized, but have been tested, and that you have probably skill set within your organization to already start doing that, and that you're not relying on certain key individuals that understand the model that you might lose through attrition or through promotion. Start somewhere simple and then build, and let the organization progress with you, because it is a journey and everyone has to do it together. If one particular department versus another gets ahead, causes just a slight dysfunction and understanding of, well, what are they doing and how do they arrive at those numbers, and they kind of need to learn it to appreciate it.
Yeah, something I would add is maybe it depends on what the pain points for your particular organization are. Maybe if it's lack of collaboration and trust, then more visibility in terms of how you got to the numbers you have could be beneficial. Something I would recommend taking a look at, though, is the last time that your process was done or even updated. If it was done a couple of years ago, even if at the time it made sense for your data and other factors out there, things are changing quickly. And so what we always encourage is retesting and reevaluation to make sure that the process isn't, getting outdated with time. So.
Yeah, good point. It looks like there was one other question too. It was, so what strategies, tools, or technologies have you found most effective for integrating demand and sales forecasting to create a more holistic view?
Yeah, I can answer that one. I think depending again on where you are on the maturity curve, having some sort of data processing tool or transformation tool. I mean, of course, I really like Alteryx. It's like a low, no code way of being able to quickly get a lot of things done. If you're on the higher end and you need to start integrating more AI and ML and you're ready for that, then you can use other tools potentially. And then having some sort of data visualization tool where you can quickly and easily show the model and process results to the various teams involved is really helpful as well. And there's a lot of capabilities that you can do with such a tool, certain what if scenarios and comparing and contrasting across the different quarters and fiscal years and things of that nature.
I would also add to that, Kyle, that I think that, demand forecasting itself, right, is its own science, its own discipline, is agnostic with regard to whatever technology you use. So I would definitely also investigate what you already have in-house today. What is your IT? Like, what's their standard support? Do they have infrastructure and platforms that they already want to use? And I would nurture those relationships and work with them. Because the forecasting methodology can be done on multiple technologies, whether, like Kyle says, Alteryx, which is a great tool, but Python's a great scripting tool as well, and it has some great modeling libraries. Then you have Databricks as well. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go buy a new solution. I think really it's all about the practice and the art of the forecasting, not necessarily the technology, and about bringing the people and the processes together. For instance, you mentioned visualization too, right? I mean, there's, I think there's a few flavors out there, some primary flavors, that I think capture most of the market. Tableau is a great visualization tool, and Power BI is as well, and ClickView. It just depends on what's already in the organization, and what are you trying to convey, and how are you getting that information disseminated to your customers. Could also help on some of that selection process. So.
Yeah, appreciate that. I think that's it on the question side of things. So with that, just one final thing that I wanted to cover with everybody. Obviously, we appreciate everybody's participation and joining today. Hopefully you found a few tidbits to maybe take back to your teams. Just as one final note, I had mentioned at the beginning of today's webinar that we've got an entire practice in sales and operations planning, obviously with demand forecasting being a piece of it. On this page here, you'll see we do have standalone accelerators as CClip, and then we do have accelerators in partnership with Alteryx. So not sure if some of you already are using Alteryx in your business already, but we've got the 3 here that we covered today, and they're completely customizable. So anyways, if it's something of interest for your teams really wanting to hone in and have a deeper conversation and see if there's any way that we might be able to help accelerate the journey that you guys are on as an organization, please feel free to reach out, and we'll be sending along a follow-up email here right after with a survey, and then as well as just a quick reach out to get your guys' thoughts. So again, appreciate the time. I think that's all we've got for today, and hopefully we'll see you here on the next CClip webinar.
Well, thank you, Jenny. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Garrett. Thanks, Kyle. Appreciate it.